five aggregates, but they take the body to be mine, they take their feelings to be mine, they take their ideas to be mine, they take their intentions to be mine, they take their consciousness to be self. Richard, do you want to say something?
Yeah, well, the political form of it is sovereignty. It was in most famous expression is Louis XIV saying that "Le Stat est moi," right? The state is me,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
After me, the deluge.
Yeah.
The personal form of it derives also from law. That is the idea that you have control, you have the absolute right to control your own property, and that the basis of property is the body. Right? It's what's yourself and what's attached to yourself. That ownership is conceived as the right to get the protection of the state if anyone denies your right to control your own property. And since the body is also considered property, it then becomes a fundamental idea of personality. Also, in India, even now, this is a very fundamental idea. In the states of India,
Yeah.
all the actual decisions are made by the top guy. That is, they're made by the chief minister. If you go to see the chief minister, say of the state of India, like of Andhra Pradesh,
Like
you'll see that of Andhra Pradesh,
Yeah.
he walks down a hallway as he leaves his office and asks for one sentence from each person in the hallway. People line the hallway and the stairs as he goes down. He has two aides on either side. The aide, he listens to the sentence, he says something to one aide, he has the other aide write down the decision, and that's it. All of the ministers just wait. They pile up everything until it comes to his attention. They make no decisions on their own. So that, I mean, this is the Indian principle of rule. The king gets all the decisions.
But don't they say that India is one of the most lively democracies in the world?
Yeah, sure. Propaganda like our own.
Yeah. Please. Wait, take the microphone.
When I am in discussion with family members about things that sometimes we don't agree on or something, they'll say, well, this is just who I am. This is me. I'm just this way. And sometimes they might even say it about something about themselves that they don't like. I'm just stubborn.
Yeah.
And the idea there implies that they cannot change, that they are stubborn, and they solidify it.
Yeah.
So that idea that we can change is also a factor in some of my confusion about self, but also in the idea that control is what we use to imply. It's implicit in, well, this is who I am and I don't want to change.
Yeah.
Implies you have the control not to change, and then accidentally somebody says something.
It implies that you don't have the control to change.
No, that you have the control to stay stubborn.
Mm-hmm.
This is who I am, and I'm choosing not to change. I have power over my ability not to change. And then someone comes along and says something that wakes you up and changes your mind.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be stubborn anymore on that particular issue or another. So that whole control to me somehow or other works in this argument. I'm having a little tiny taste of the idea of it. That I think I have control, and therefore that makes me stick my feet in the ground for different opinions or ideas or dharma. And yet when I really open my mind, I suddenly see more, and I let go of those, and therefore I am impermanent. My ideas, my thoughts, my choices, and suddenly I let go of control, and things are easier or less conflict. So I know this idea is possible, that I think control is what makes me who I am, and yet letting go changes my whole life.
Yeah. Okay, Richard, and then
You said something, you didn't write it on the board, but you said something a little earlier, right? We talked about how dukkha has been left out.
Yeah.
Dukkha had been left out in the earlier discussion, hasn't quite come in yet, but that seems to be central to this issue. It's not whether you argue that total control or is the issue or not, but the idea of identifying yourself with your body and the fact that you don't have complete control over it leads to dukkha. And I think the Buddha's teaching really is about the how do you stop having dukkha? How do you get,
in fact, we're going
get
to
freedom from it?
Yes.
I guess that's coming to
The argument is going to counter the point of dukkha just in a little while.
Yeah. So.
I just wanted to echo the point the woman made earlier about the identification of the self and control. The idea that the defining feature of self is control. And it seems to be the case in Western theology. I'm no master of it, but in many religious systems, they conceive of a higher self, or an indwelling self, or a true self that has no connection with the person, with the aggregates, with the perceptions, and that the progress towards the true self is really giving up notions of control. Or even the English word to suffer means to bear, to bear the reality. I mean, I was just recently listening to some Christian theologians, and I asked them to explain what it means to progress towards the true self. And they said, paradoxically, it's to give up notions of control. So that it really is very much like we hear non-self or no self described. It's curious to me that his argument is based on such a narrow definition
of self. I have to say, I agree with that too. But it seems like this must have been the shared point of view or assumption of the period, that for there to be a self, it's something that has to exercise control over those things that are taken to be the self or to belong to the self.
And I can see that very often one would subtly, in Western conceiving of a higher self, all too easily becomes an identification with
Okay, I think I want to move on because I want to try to finish the sutta. So, okay, now we see where the argument goes from here. Okay, so Saccaka has admitted that he doesn't have that control over the 5 aggregates, and the Buddha has pointed out that there's a contradiction. Okay, now the Buddha is going to approach the issue from a somewhat different angle. First, he starts off with the question about permanence or impermanence. What do you think? Is material form permanent or impermanent? Okay, then Saccaka says it's impermanent. Then is what is impermanent? Here the questions in Pali is sukha or dukkha va sukha va, which is translated suffering or happiness. And again, there's maybe the translation, it's a little bit unsatisfactory. Because the idea is that whatever is impermanent, it doesn't mean that whatever is impermanent is felt as being painful, a cause of misery, or as suffering, but rather the idea is that whatever is impermanent is incapable of providing some kind of permanent happiness, that whatever is impermanent is insecure, unstable, unreliable, and because it's insecure, unstable, unreliable, it can become a basis for suffering if one clings to it in the hope of finding stability, security, and something reliable within it. Okay, so Saccaka admits that what is impermanent is dukkha, in the sense of unstable, unreliable, insecure. Okay, then he says, is what is impermanent, dukkha, and subject to change, fit to be regarded thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. Okay, so the same argument is presented, is laid out in regard to all five aggregates. So all five aggregates are impermanent. Because they're impermanent, they're dukkha. And because they're dukkha, because they're impermanent, changing, dukkha, they cannot be regarded as self, as mine, I, and myself.
Why couldn't he answer, no, they're not fit to be myself, but they are. In other words, I'm impermanent, I'm suffering, and I'm subject to change, and that's me. What can I do about it?
Yeah. I think because the idea of self would have to involve, in this way of thinking, would have to involve permanence, unchangeableness, and not being subject to dukkha.
Yeah, but isn't that a Brahminical idea of self? That's a pre-existing definition, cultural definition of self that I think many of us don't have anymore. It was the Hindu, the upper caste Hindu idea of the self.
Yeah, I know that, yeah. But, I mean, the Buddha was speaking within the context of that society and that culture. And actually what has struck me is that, especially nowadays, the idea of self and non-self from Buddhism is not particularly problematic for people. You know, because when people are taught or learn that Buddhism teaches there's no permanent self, no substantial self, it's not a big problem. What becomes a problem is, probably the real problem is teaching that everything is dukkha, because we're always still seeking sukha, pleasure or enjoyment in some form. But in India at that time, the big quest was to find the self and to find something to identify with as self. Okay, so now the five aggregates are all impermanent. They're all, because they're impermanent, they're bound up with their dukkha. Because they're impermanent and dukkha, they're non-self. And so now the Buddha brings in, maybe this is why the characteristic of suffering was left out from the earlier part of the discourse, in order to give it a more dramatic impact now at this point. So the Buddha says, what do you think, Agivesana, when one adheres to suffering, resorts to suffering, holds to suffering and regards what is suffering thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself, could one ever fully understood suffering oneself or abide with suffering utterly destroyed? And then Saccaka answers, how is that possible, Master Gotama? No. Let me try to approach this by breaking the question down, actually to take it into two parts. Okay, first, when one regards the five aggregates as impermanent, then the point is that since they're impermanent, they're dukkha. And so what one is saying, this is myself, turns out to be dukkha, to be suffering. So what one is saying, what one is identifying with, this is myself, let's say when one identifies with anything and says, this is myself, what one is doing is adhering to dukkha, resorting to dukkha, holding to dukkha, and saying, what is dukkha, what is suffering is myself. But in a way, that is what one doesn't want to do. One wants to get free from dukkha. And so if one is taking the five aggregates to be myself, and they're dukkha, then one is saying, what is dukkha is myself. So one is not going to get free from suffering by identifying with what is suffering and saying what is suffering is myself. Were you going to say something, Andrea?
No, I was just thinking, hence when they talk about the Four Noble Truths in brief, hence the 5 aggregates,
Yeah.
subject to cleaning are dukkha. They're what's suffering, not
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Yes? No?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so that is the first part. Then the second part would be, if one is clinging to suffering and regarding it, this is myself, could one ever fully understand suffering and completely destroy suffering? So if one is clinging to what is suffering as myself, then one is not going to be able to overcome suffering and to become fully liberated from suffering. Because one is taking what is suffering, in this case the 5 aggregates, to be the very essence of one's being. And so therefore one will go on adhering to the 5 aggregates, clinging to the 5 aggregates. Okay, so Saccaka says, no, Master Gautama. Then the Buddha says, what do you think, Saccaka? That being so, do you not adhere to suffering, resort to suffering, hold to suffering, and regard what is suffering thus? This is mine, this I am, this is myself. Then Saccaka says, how could I not, Master Gautama? Yes, Master Gautama. I have to say, it seems to me that these 2 paragraphs should have been, that they're in the wrong order. They should have been inverted. Doesn't that seem to be the case? Okay, let's take it with the inversion, the way I would reorganize it. Okay, starting paragraph 21, the Buddha would say, what do you think, Agivesana? Leave out that being so. Are you adhering to suffering, resorting to suffering, holding to suffering, and regarding what is suffering thus? This is mine, this I am, this is myself. And Saccaka says, how could I not, Master Gautama? Yes, Master Gautama. Then the question comes, when one adheres to suffering, resorts to suffering, holds to suffering, and regards what is suffering thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself, could one ever fully understand suffering oneself, or abide with suffering utterly destroyed? Which way does it make better sense? The way it's down here, with 2,000, maybe 300 years of tradition behind it, or the way I propose with 5 seconds behind it. Which way?
Your way.
Of course, it has to be that way. Anybody disagree with her?
I abstain. Thunderbolt wielding spirits. Is there suffering involved?
Anybody disagree with her? Second time. Third time? Okay, then the Buddha is going to show him sort of where he stands now, paragraph 22. It is just as if a man needing hardwood, searching for hardwood, but to go into the woods, and he would see a large plantain. Does everybody know what a plantain is? It's really like a banana, a small kind of banana. He sees a banana trunk, straight, young, without the fruit bud core. Then he cuts it down at the root, and he starts unrolling it, looking for heartwood. but as he removes one sheath of the cellulose material after another, he doesn't even come upon softwood, let alone heartwood. And so, when you pressed, questioned, cross-questioned me, when you were pressed, questioned, cross-questioned me about your own position, you turn out to be empty, vacant, and mistaken. But it was you who were making this claim before the Vaisali assembly. I see no ascetic or Brahmin who can beat me in debate. If I were to get into debate with them, I would shake them, make them shiver, tremble, and I would make them shed sweat from the armpits. Then the Buddha says, now there are drops of sweat on your forehead, and they have soaked through your robe, and the sweat is falling to the ground. But there is no sweat on my body now. And then the Blessed One uncovers his golden-colored body before the assembly. He takes off his upper robe and he shows that he's completely calm, cool, free from sweat. You can see that the preacher is preaching this way to the Buddhist assembly of lay devotees, and he describes the Buddha in this way, and the lay devotees are all sitting with their hands like this and going, sadhu, 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 wonderful, wonderful. Okay, then at this point, Saccaka, the great debater, is now sitting there. He's utterly humiliated, silent, dismayed, unable to respond. Okay, then one of the Licchavis gets up and he gives a simile to describe Saccaka's position. He says, he gives a simile of a group of boys and girls. They go out from a town or village to a pond, and then there's a crab living in that pond, and they pull the crab out from the pond, and then whenever the crab extends one of its legs, they smash it with sticks and stones. And so after some time, all of the crab's legs will be broken, smashed, and the crab would be unable to get back into the pond. And so whenever Saccaka made some assertion, form is self, feeling is self, the Buddha has cut it off, broken it, smashed it. And so now Saccaka cannot get back to the Buddha for the purpose of debate. I have to say, what strikes me a little bit about this kind of dialogue, usually we think of, at least in the popular imagination, the Buddha is always very kind, gentle, soft, no competitive spirit. But there seems to be a pretty strong competitive spirit coming through the presentation of this dialogue. Like, our hero is the Buddha, super monk. And sort of the bad guy is Saccaka, who challenges the Buddha in debate. And now we see the bad guy is all sweaty, silent, unable to debate any further. And super monk doesn't even give off any drops of sweat. Okay, so then Saccaka now is humbled, and now he wants to ask the Buddha some questions. Let there be no sound of a gong. You see, it's following my will. We'll let the sound of the wooden clock go, but no metal gong. You see, it just wouldn't block. No. Silence. Okay, now it seems to me that this part of the discourse, I can't believe that it was not framed by monks who knew the subtleties of the teaching. It always seems longer on Saturdays than on other days. Okay, I was saying that it seems to me that this part of the discourse had to be framed by monks, because in effect what they're going to do is to have Saccaka ask about the distinction between the disciple who is at the stage of a Saccaka, that is a trainee, and one who is an Arahant. And so if Saccaka was not highly learned about the Buddha's teachings, he wouldn't have been able to frame the questions in this way. Okay, so Saccaka asked the Buddha, he says, in what way is a disciple of the Master Gautama one who carries out his instruction, responds to his advice, has crossed beyond doubt, become free from perplexity, gained intrepidity, and become independent of others in the teacher's dispensation or his teaching? Okay, so this is the question which is really asking, what is the special or distinctive achievement of a stream enterer? One who has entered the stream of the Dharma, but has not yet become an Arahant. So somebody still undergoing the training. And then the Buddha replies, in terms of the teaching of non-self, any kind of material form, whatever, past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, the disciple sees all material form as it really is with proper wisdom. Thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. The same with feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. He sees all consciousness as it really is, with proper wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. So that is the way one is a disciple of the Buddha who has crossed over doubt, become free from perplexity, and so on, and become independent of others in the teaching. So the stream enterer, or once returner, or non-returner, they have seen the truth of the Dhamma. They have seen the five aggregates as being non-self. So they've obliterated all views of a self with regard to the five aggregates. And in this way, they're utterly free from doubt because of direct insight into the teaching. Okay, but apparently Saccaka, at least in the discourse, he knows the distinction between the trainee and the Arahant. So now he asks, in what way is a Bhikkhu an Arahant, one who has destroyed all the defilements, who has lived the holy life, done what had to be done, and so on. One who is completely liberated through final knowledge. Okay, now to be completely liberated, it's not enough simply to see the truth of non-self, but one has to develop that insight, develop that realization to the point that one eliminates all clinging. And so the Buddha answers, here, any kind of material form, whatever, past, present, or future, the bhikkhu has seen material form as it really is. This is not mine, this is not I, this is not myself. And through not clinging, he is liberated. Any kind of feeling, perception, mental formations, any kind of consciousness, he has seen it all as being not mine, not myself, and through not clinging, he's liberated. So in other words, the ordinary, the noble disciple who's a trainee, stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, have seen the truth of non-self, but they've not yet liberated the mind from all clinging. So they still have work to do, they still have to develop that insight further. But when they develop the insight further to the ultimate point, then the mind is liberated from all clinging. And with the liberation of the mind from all clinging, then the disciple becomes an Arahant, one who has destroyed all the defilements and is completely liberated through final knowledge. Okay, then the Buddha goes on and he says, he makes a very interesting point. He's now going to sort of highlight the difference between himself and those who are liberated through his guidance. He says, when a bhikkhu's mind is thus liberated, he possesses three unsurpassable qualities: unsurpassable vision or insight, unsurpassable practice or cultivation, and unsurpassable deliverance or liberation. But still, such a disciple honors, respects, reveres, and venerates the Tathagata. And for what reason? Because the Blessed One is enlightened, and he teaches the Dhamma for the sake of enlightenment. The Blessed One is tame. He teaches the Dhamma for the sake of taming oneself. The Blessed One is at peace and teaches the Dhamma for the sake of peace. He has crossed over the stream of birth and death, and he teaches the Dhamma to cross others over. The Blessed One has attained Nibbana, and he teaches the Dhamma to bring others to Nibbana. Okay, so when this is said, then Saccaka, in effect, he apologizes to the Buddha. He shows how foolish he was to attack the Buddha, and then he invites the Buddha, together with the Sangha, to come for the next day's meal. The Blessed One accepts in silence, and since Saccaka was a wanderer, a wandering debater, he didn't have all of the foodstuffs for preparing a meal himself, so he asked the Lichavis to contribute, to bring food to offer to the group for the next day's meal. And so the Lichavis prepared some 500 ceremonial dishes of milk rice as gifts of food, and Saccaka has various other foods, of various kinds of good food prepared in his own park. And then he announces the time to the Buddha, and then he offers the meal to the Buddha. After the meal, I'm in paragraph 30 now, Saccaka makes the wish, may the merit and the fruits of this deed of merit go to the happiness of the danas, that is, to
The idea of the boasting.
The boasting that comes up regularly, or not exactly boasting, but these unsurpassable.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, is an area where I struggle really hard
Yeah.
because it is what I was trying to let go of, another tradition.
Yeah.
It's always like, this is right. No one can argue with the Buddha. No one will ever successfully debate the Buddha because he's the one true knower. And I am surprised when I keep running into it, and I wish you had an answer for it. I struggle or believe that it's the human condition, that when you believe something, you want it to be the best, the truest, and that the people who put this down just added that in. It's hard for me to keep hearing this in sutras, the Buddha saying, well, you know, nobody knows it as well as I do. And I am the best, and I'm the most unsurpassable.
Yeah.
And it's just like that first viewer who came up when Buddha first awakened, and he came up and the guy said, wow, you're glowing, there's something about you, what is it? Oh, well, I'm an Arahant. And the guy, oh yeah, sure, and ran away.
Yeah.
And the Buddha then went on to teach it differently,
Yeah.
so that it could be heard.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
help. Why?
I have to say, I don't know, you know, we have to remember that these texts were passed down for some 400, 500 years by oral transmission. So we don't really know for certain what did the Buddha say himself, and what could the transmitters who would have been involved in debates with the followers of other schools in India, other schools of religion and philosophy in India. And I think you say the human, so the natural human tendency is to exalt our teacher, our founder, our leader. And so such ideas could have come into the, or such statements could have come into the text in order to try to show, you know, our teacher is better than your teacher. We are the ones who have the absolute truth. At least the one thing that's certain for me, is that for Buddhism, you know, the way to deliverance is not by believing something, but by following a course of practice that will lead to personal insights. So all of this is not saying you have to accept that the Buddha is number one, but you know, that could have just come out of the tone of religious controversy of the period. And the important point is what is there to understand and to practice. That's the way I approach it. Andrea, I have something.
And who's to say that the Buddha has to be, quote, nice? I mean,
Wait.
Who's to say that the Buddha has to be, quote, nice?
Yeah.
That's a real misconception, that religious figures have to be nicey-wicey.
Yeah.
He doesn't really come across mean, if you read,
Yeah.
but he has a definite personality. If
Yeah.
you want sweetness in life, you have to look at Ananda. He really is
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
kind.
Yeah.
He was probably always that way. He's just a very kind guy. I can't stand Kasapa, okay?
Excuse me?
I can't stand Kasapa. Doesn't mean he wasn't enlightened. They all have their personalities.
Yeah.
And I just think people think that everybody's supposed to be floating up and down in a deer park with sitars playing. It's not necessarily how it is. And just because someone might be harsh, for instance, Venerable Mahakassapa, he was kind of harsh, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was harsh, yeah.
He was, okay. He was still a very good teacher of Buddhism.
Yeah.
Okay? He wasn't Ananda. He wasn't Sariputta. Sariputta also seems rather nice.
Yeah, very soft, yeah.
Very soft. Not, Ananda is the one with the halo around his head. But
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's
I have to say, some of the statements that we find in the text still seem a little bit too boastful for me. But also, maybe one has to say that, at least in certain contexts, the Buddha, since he is the one who's sort of founding the teaching, has to give some support to inspire confidence in others, let's say. And in that period, it might have been the way that teachers set forth their teaching. You know, if one says, yes, everything is good, one guy is teaching everybody is annihilated with the breakup of the body after death. Somebody says there's no result for good and bad deeds. And, you know, we say, okay, we all have part of the truth. Maybe your truth, you have the truth from one angle, I have the truth from, this one has the truth from another angle. Maybe there are some faults in my teaching, trying to be modest. Then you're not really establishing, you might call the Dhamma in the world. So
it
maybe we should
depends
say.
on who he spoke with.
Excuse me?
It depends on who he was speaking with also.
Yeah.
When people came to him, what was the one? Where the Brahmin came to him, like, flipped out. My son, that ingrate, he kicked me out, I'm starving, I'm on the street. That's a sutta which I love. Because he goes to the Buddha.
The sons.
Yeah, he said that my son's ingrate wife had kicked me out like a dog, like a dirty dog, and I'm
Yeah,
lonely and scared and sad and everything. And
Yeah.
the Buddha basically, he doesn't try to teach him the Dhamma. He just says, I know what you do. Go out in the middle of the day when everybody's out.
Yeah.
And just say what you said to me and come back to me in a few days. He gave
Yeah.
very practical advice.
Yeah, the Buddha gave him some verses to recite to his
Yeah,
son.
but it was basically go out and
Yeah.
embarrass them or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it depends upon who he spoke to also. He could be kind if
Yeah,
people were really
yeah, yeah.
upset. He could,
Yeah.
it just didn't matter.
Okay, we'll end here, and then we'll come back. Maybe we'll meet at 12:15 to carry on discussion period. Okay, so we end with the sharing of the merits. Akasaka chubumata deva naga mahedika punyantang anumoditva chiram rakantu sasanam. Akasaka chubumata deva naga mahedika punyantang anumoditva chiram rakantu desanam. Akasata chubumata Deva naga mahedika punyantang anumoditva chiram rakantu mam param. Eta vatacha mehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe devanumodantu sabbe bhutanumodantu sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya bhavagupadhaya vichitato Etantere Saccaka Upapanna Rupiya Rupicha Sanya Sanino Dukkha Pamuchantu Pusantu Nihuting. Okay, I just want to mention, next Saturday there won't be the class, but the next class will be the week after, September 18th.